Lovely. Wow, aren't we lucky to have heard that original recording of a man in 1541 enjoying a crunchy snack. Truly remarkable. Hello there, and welcome back to the final couplet with me, Theo Cowan. Today we're looking at another one of William Shakespeare's sonnets, of course. And since we did Sonnet 105 last week, it only makes sense that we look at Sonnet 106. Before we dive into that, I just wanted to ask a question. I thought maybe it might be fun to do, just as a sort of side project, a little YouTube series of looking at one of Shakespeare's plays. Apparently he wrote some plays, and what if I sort of looked at that and broke down some of the scenes and the themes, etc., what would be a good one to look at, do we think? Romeo and Juliet? That's quite basic, isn't it? Everyone knows what happens in that. That's quite straightforward. But also on the other end of the spectrum, there's King John. And does anyone want to know about King John? Probably not. It's not his best work. So if I could look at any, what would it be? And would that be a fun series? And it wouldn't just be audio, maybe. It would be video. And fun, maybe. Anyway, let's dive into Sonnet 106. When in the chronicle of wasted time I see descriptions of the fairest wights, and beauty making beautiful old rhyme in praise of ladies dead and lovely knights, then in the blazon of sweet beauty's best, of hand, of foot, of lip, of eye, of brow, I see their antique pen would have expressed even such a beauty as you master now. So all their praises are but prophecies of this our time, all you prefiguring. And for they looked but with divining eyes, they had not skill enough your worth to sing. For we, which now behold these present days, have eyes to wonder, but lack tongues to praise. Wow, so there we have it, Sonnet 106. And guess what? Shakespeare is still talking about his sexy young lover. What a surprise. And I feel like we have had a sonnet similar to this in the past, where he is comparing writers of the past and their work to his own and his lover's beauty. Maybe he forgot that he has already written about this before, and he might be getting on a bit at this point, but he has written about this before. Anyway, we welcome another one with open arms, don't we? And I think if I were to sum up Sonnet 106, I'd say Shakespeare is saying, look, I've read a load of old poems and stuff like that, and they always talk about really beautiful people, and the beauty that they're describing is actually the beauty that I'm seeing in you. Your amazing beauty. But back then, there weren't actually people as beautiful as you. They were just imagining it. But now we can see it, and we find it really hard to describe, actually, now that we can actually see it. So that's the gist of it. Let's dive in line by line and work out what the hell Shakespeare was going on about in Sonnet 106. So we start with, when in the chronicle of wasted time I see descriptions of the fairest wights. Let's stop there, even though the thought does continue on, but it's a very long thought, this one. So really he's saying, when in accounts of olden times, of history, wasted time is a really interesting way of saying, olden days, isn't it? I think that's really quite beautiful, very poetic. Time that's wasted away. I don't think he's meaning literally wasted. Oh no, that's that was a wasted 100 years. Nothing happened. We wasted it. I think he's talking about sort of eroding. So when in accounts of olden days, I happen upon a description of a very beautiful person or people, fairest wights. So fair, we know by now, beautiful is the meaning, really. And wights was a word that people used for people, for person. A wight or wights, which is an interesting term, isn't it? And that term harps way back to Middle English, I think. You might find that in, I don't know if you'll find it actually in Chaucer, but that sort of language, wights, and that's really not carried through to the modern day, has it? So, when I'm looking back in accounts of historic times, I'm coming across these descriptions of really beautiful people, and then he continues with, and beauty making beautiful old rhyme in praise of ladies dead and lovely knights. So he's talking here about poems that he's reading, old, ancient, well, not ancient necessarily, but old poems, maybe ancient, never say never, poems that are praising lovely ladies that are now dead, of course. Obviously they're dead because it was years ago. And lovely knights. That's quite a funny word to put before knights, isn't it? Lovely. Quite an interesting description. I would never think of, I'd think brave knights, maybe. But I've never heard or thought about the term lovely knights. It sort of, in my head, diminishes a knight. I don't think a knight would want to be called lovely. They'd want to be called heroic. But, oh, it's a lovely night. Oh, hello, you're a lovely knight, aren't you? I mean, I guess in the modern equivalent, it would say, you'd say something like a lovely soldier. I mean, they're just people at the end of the day, aren't they? So, why can't they be lovely? Anyway, he continues with, then in the blazon of sweet beauty's best. So blazon is another word that we don't use in this context particularly anymore. And it was a poetic form where the poet sort of catalogued their lovers' physical features. And he'll go on to talk about this in his next line, Shakespeare, in Sonnet 106. So essentially here he's saying, when I see these poets catalogue their beauty, the beautiful features of their subject, of their fair subject, and these features are of hand, of foot, of lip, of eye, of brow. I probably don't need to translate those for you, but brow is an interesting one. Brow, Shakespeare talks about quite a lot, doesn't he? And I feel like it was very common to talk about this in love poetry at the time. But brow, in my mind, is your forehead, really, isn't it? And it's an interesting feature to pick out, to say you've got a lovely forehead, haven't you? It certainly isn't the first feature I pick out when I look at someone, usually, unless they've got a massive forehead, in which case, yeah, you would maybe, or a particularly tiny one. But it's not, in my mind, I wouldn't go, wow, what a lovely brow they've got, what beautiful forehead, really perfect. But anyway, each to their own. And of course that might have been, well, it sounds like it was quite a big thing back in the day. Back in Shakespeare's time, everyone was talking about brows. Then he continues with, I see their antique pen would have expressed even such a beauty as you master now. So when he sees these poems catalogue their beauty of hands, feet, lips, eyes, foreheads, he realises that these old writers were essentially trying to describe the beauty that his lover has now. His gorgeous lover, that's what they were trying to describe. And then he continues with, so all their praises are but prophecies of this our time, all you prefiguring. So all these praises from these old writers, they were actually prophecies for our time, not our time now, Shakespeare's time, as he was writing it. And all of them basically prefigure you, aka my sexy young lover. So these writers, when they were describing this incredible beauty, they were prophesying you, in Shakespeare's time, Shakespeare's lover. I'm sure those old writers would have a thing or two to say about that, but of course they would be dead, so they couldn't argue. But I imagine when they were writing about the beauty of someone back in the day, they probably, and look, you can have your own thoughts about this, probably weren't picturing Shakespeare's lover hundreds of years later. That's my hot take on that, but Shakespeare, of course, has his own view. And as we know from Shakespeare, everything is about his lover. He is absolutely obsessed. And then we continue with, and for they looked but with divining eyes, they had not skill enough your worth to sing. So here, I think he's saying, but because they only wrote with, this prophetic imagination, they didn't actually have the skill to capture your exact incredible beauty, these old writers. There is another take on this that I don't land with quite as much as the one I just had, but the other take is, if these writers hadn't have been divinely inspired and prophets, essentially, they wouldn't have had the skill to describe your beauty. Now, I think it's the first one. I think it's that these old writers, because they were only writing through their prophetic imagination, they didn't quite have the skill to capture your beauty, Shakespeare's young lover's beauty. I'm going to land with that. If you think differently, please plead your point. And now we're on to the final couplet. For we, which now behold these present days, have eyes to wonder, but lack tongues to praise. So he's tying it all back now to the present day and to his lover. And he's saying we, who are alive now, today, to actually look at you and see your incredible beauty, we're able to marvel at your beauty, all right? We can go, wow, that is one hot, sexy guy. But we don't have the poetic skill to describe it. And Shakespeare's talked about this before in previous sonnets, hasn't he? Where he's written a poem basically to say, I can't write about your beauty. There's no way that I can describe it. You are just so incredible that all these poetic techniques and stuff that I have and descriptions that I have up my sleeve are not enough. I can't possibly describe how incredible and beautiful you are. And that's a similar situation here in this final couplet, isn't it? He's saying, we can all look at you and we can see how amazing you look. But just like these old writers in many ways, we can't describe your beauty. It's actually impossible. So there we have it, Sonnet 106. And I think it's about time we put this to our story. And if you remember last week, Shakespeare and Ben Jonson have gone to church on a Sunday. And Ben Jonson's invited Shakespeare. He said, you never guessed he was going to be there, Christopher Marlowe. Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, I mean, they've had a turbulent up and down relationship, and they haven't really seen each other for a while. Shakespeare went a bit crazy and obsessive over Christopher Marlowe, and Christopher Marlowe said, let's just knock it on the head, call it a day. Anyway, they go to church on a Sunday. Shakespeare sees Marlowe. They have a little exchange, and then Shakespeare says, look, I need to read you this sonnet. all right, I've been listening to that sermon by the priest, and it's inspired me. And they've gone outside into the graveyard. Ben Jonson's still there, if I remember correctly, and Shakespeare recites Sonnet 105 to him, which is sort of using religious language as a gag in a way. He's sort of taking the piss out of it, potentially. But he's using it to say, you are actually beauty, kindness, and fidelity combined into one person, which is incredibly rare, and you're amazing. So let's see how Marlowe receives that, and how Sonnet 106 fits into all this. Shakespeare finishes reading Sonnet 105 to Christopher Marlowe in the graveyard. Marlowe says, Shakespeare, you know, it is amazing that you think of me like this. And actually, it's very clever that you use the religious language that we were just listening to in the church. That is very clever. And I preferred it to your mad old poem recently where you said that flowers were stealing parts of me. And Shakespeare says, yes, I realised that was a particularly insane poem. But this one, you know, is more my old self, isn't it? Don't you think, Marlowe? Did you like it? Do you really think you are beauty, kindness, and fidelity all rolled into one? And Marlowe says, well, I'm just a guy, to be honest, Shakespeare. I'm just Christopher Marlowe. You know, I'm a hell of a writer. Don't get me wrong, and I'm a good-looking guy. But I think you're blowing it all out of proportion. I am just a man at the end of the day. Ben Jonson, who's also been there sort of as a third wheel, slowly just sort of backs away. And Shakespeare says, Ben, hey, stop, where are you going? Where are you going? Look, can't you see that there's something between Christopher Marlowe and me? There's still a spark. Ben Jonson says, yeah, look, there is. I can see it. I'm not going to lie, I can't lie. But you were crazy, Shakespeare. You locked Marlowe in your holiday cottage. And Shakespeare says, yes, because he had a sex addiction. And Ben Jonson says, yes, I know, but that's not the way to deal with it. Anyway, I think the only way that we can move past this is all to go to the Nag's Head for a lovely pint of mead and just forget all about it. Marlowe and Shakespeare looked at each other and said, oh, okay, let's go. So the three of them wandered off to the Nag's Head for a lovely pint. Later that evening, Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson and William Shakespeare were having the time of their lives. They were 7 meads deep at this point, up on the tables, dancing and singing, getting everyone involved. They were spinning each other round. It really was a raucous atmosphere. And Shakespeare said, hey, Marlowe, I'm going out for a smoke of my opium pipe. You fancy a puff? And Marlowe says, oh, go on then, Shakespeare, I'll join you for a puff of opium. And they both wander out into the street. Shakespeare pulls out his opium pipe and they each have a little toke. Shakespeare says, look, Marlowe, I know I've been a weird guy recently, but just so you know, I still have feelings for you. I'm sorry, I do. And Marlowe says, Shakespeare, look, even though you've been insane and I have a problem with addiction, I also have feelings for you. They look at each other for a while, and then they embrace. Maybe it was the alcohol talking, or indeed the opium. But Shakespeare said, look, why don't you come back to mine? Come on. And Marlowe nodded his head. They both wandered off, leaving poor old Ben Jonson in the pub on his own. Half an hour later they arrived at Shakespeare's house, bundled in through the door, making out like a couple of teenagers. Shakespeare says, I'm just going to pop to the toilet. You just make yourself at home. He heads off to the toilet, leaving Christopher Marlowe on his own. Marlowe looks around him, at the familiar sights of Shakespeare's home. And then he sees a door ajar. He thinks, I don't think I've ever been in this room. So, inquisitively, he walks through the mystery door. And what he sees takes him aback. The walls are lined with hundreds, if not thousands, of bits of literature, all highlighted, and there's strings between them and pins, and almost like you would see in one of those investigation rooms on CSI. And in the middle, linking all of these bits of literature and scraps of paper, was a painting of one man. It was himself, Christopher Marlowe. Shakespeare, back from the toilet, shouts out, "Marlowe, where are you?" Marlowe can hardly answer. He's still in shock. What is this mad shrine that Shakespeare has created? Shakespeare steps into the room behind him and goes, yes. Oh dear, you weren't supposed to see this. Marlowe turns around and says, "What the hell is this, Shakespeare?" And Shakespeare said, "Well, it's not as crazy as it looks. It's all it is I've been collecting sort of old scraps of poems and literature from hundreds of years, and been looking at how these writers describe beauty and love and their lovers and lovely knights and dead ladies and stuff like that, and how none of them compare to your beauty." Marlowe says, "Wow, you have done a lot of research on this." And Shakespeare says, "Yes, I've had quite a lot of time on my hands recently. You know, haven't really been doing much else apart from this. But so it turns out no one can really describe your beauty. So that's sort of the outcome of that." Marlowe says, "Right." And Shakespeare says, "Look, I wasn't really supposed to read this to you. Maybe this is not the right time, but I did sort of, after doing all this research, compose a sonnet of sorts, all about my findings, and I think now would be the perfect time to read it to you. Do you mind?" Marlowe says, "Oh, Shakespeare, look, I'm sobering up quite quickly now, and the opium's worn off, and I think I should probably go home. I've made a big mistake." And Shakespeare runs over to the door and locks it and says, No, you haven't made a mistake. You haven't made a mistake, Marlowe. You're in the perfect place right now. Sit down." He grabs Marlowe by the shoulders and puts him into a chair and says, "Now listen to this." He rustles through some papers and finds Sonnet 106, clears his throat and reads, Sonnet 106. "When in chronicles of olden days I see descriptions of beautiful people, and read the beautiful poems about them, in praise of ladies now dead and lovely knights, then in the love poems that catalogue their beauty, their hands, feet, lips, eyes, and foreheads, I see that these old writers were describing the same beauty that you currently possess. So, all these writers' praises are prophecies of our time. All of them prefigure you. But because they only wrote with prophetic imagination, they didn't have the skill to capture your full worth. We, who are alive now to actually see you, are able to marvel at your beauty. But we don't have the poetic skill to describe it. So there we have it, Sonnet 106, and the story to go with it. Shakespeare has lost his marbles yet again, and I'm a little bit worried for Marlowe in this situation. It doesn't seem good for him. But you'll have to find out what happens next week on the final couplet. Until then,